The Human Optimization Podcast is proudly brought to you by Vicon Supplements, where quality meets sustainability. Vicon's all-natural supplements are handcrafted and sustainably produced in Canada, bringing you products that nourish both your well-being and our planet. Visit ViconSupplements.com today and be a part of a greener, healthier future.
Are you ready to embark on a journey to the best version of you? Join me, Lisa Pitel-Killah, as I dive deep into the world of hair tissue mineral analysis and functional medicine with fellow experts, and guide you on the path of unlocking your full potential. As a multi-time kettlebell sport world champion, I'm on a mission to reach high-performance professionals from around the world to help you minimize tiring symptoms, maximize health, and gain unstoppable energy. This is the Human Optimization Podcast. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Lisa Pitel-Killah, and I have Dr. Michael Biamonte here with us today to share some amazing information. He is the founder of the Biamonte Center for Clinical Nutrition. He's also the co-creator of BioCybernetics, which is an unprecedented computer software program that's able to study blood work, mineral tests, and many other lab tests to determine exactly what your body needs, and is imbalanced, initially designed for aerospace purposes. As a practitioner for over 30 years, he's dedicated to improving the lives of his patients and helping them get back to living. He holds a doctorate in Nutripathy and is a New York State certified clinical nutritionist. He is a professional member of the International and American Association of Clinical Nutritionists, the American College of Nutrition, and is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Clinical Nutrition Certification Board. He's listed in the Directory of Distinguished Americans for his research in nutrition and physiology. Wow. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for spending time with us today and being able to share. And love hearing as well. I want to dive into, kind of determining exactly where your body's imbalanced from that perspective as well. So let's start. There's always a story behind the guest, right? How did we end up here? So let's talk through that and how you ended up here.
Well, I was in naturopathic school, minding my own business, and I was sort of majoring in interpretation of lab work.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that when I got out of school, because I was just becoming interested in computers, this was back in 1983.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided that what I wanted to do is I wanted to take all the knowledge I had on interpretation of blood work and have a computer be able to do it just really quick. So I was going around introducing myself as a new nutritionist to Long Island,
Mm-hmm.
going into health food stores, passing out my business card, telling them what I wanted to do. And a woman I met there in Massapequa told me that I needed to meet Dr. Santoro because he was already doing this. He already had a computer and he had all this data on the computer. So she gave me his business card and I called him up. And it turns out that this fellow, Robert Santoro, was the scientist who designed the life support systems on the lunar module. He just wasn't some lightweight character, And he worked at Grumman for NASA, and they now had him on a project where he was to develop computer software so that they could analyze the astronauts' blood work when they were in deep space missions, in order to determine what nutrients they needed, so that they wouldn't end up with muscle loss and calcium loss and all this stuff.
Of course.
So I worked with him for 10 years to advance this computer model.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point where we then started to use it privately in our own practices. And we noticed that there was about 20% of the people who were using the system who had bizarre reactions to the vitamins. As a matter of fact, they had bizarre reactions to everything, these people.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't handle medications. Medications made them whacked out. Vitamins made them whacked out. Everything made them whacked out. And at that point, we had taken ownership of the model because NASA felt it was too expensive to carry on. So they actually gave us all the data, and we formed the private corporation, BioCybernetics.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to volunteer to find out what was wrong with this 30% or so of the people who were having these crazy reactions to vitamins, all kinds of allergic reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a pattern in their blood work that indicated some kind of infection going on in their colon and in their small intestine.
Wow.
I didn't know. I had no clue what that could be.
Mm-hmm.
So we had them do microbiology and mycology studies on their stool. And sure enough, we found out all of them had an absence of normal intestinal flora, and the majority of them had Candida.
Interesting.
Now, back in those days, this is 1984, I really didn't know what Candida was.
Mm-hmm.
I read about it once in a mycology book that it was some fungus that lived in your gut, but other than that, I really didn't know too much about it. So I guess I was both kind of naive and stupid. And I told the patients, go to your medical doctor. Tell him you have Candida and tell him, like, to have him cure you of it and then come back to us and we'll get you back on the vitamin program.
Yeah.
And I got the darndest feedback from these people. I heard, the doctor said there's no such thing as Candida, or the doctor said everybody has Candida, so it makes no difference.
Mm-hmm.
Or the doctor got all pissed off and he says, well, I don't know what to tell you, go somewhere else. All these stories. So I didn't know what to do at that point. The only thing I knew to do was to send these same people to Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Atkins in Manhattan, because they were the two functional medical doctors we had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if no, I don't even think he was practicing back then. So I sent them there and I said, listen, go to these two doctors because they'll know what I'm talking about. And they went, and then they came back to me and they said this was much better. They knew what this was about, and they put me on a treatment. And after a few months, I started to feel better, but then all the symptoms came back. And they all told me the same thing, that after a few months on the treatment, they felt better, but then all of a sudden, all the symptoms came back, and a light bulb went over my head. And I said, gee, now why would that be? So I just started to listen to I took as many notes from them as I could.
Yeah.
And I started to buy and procure lots of books on mycology and the study of fungus and yeast and how friendly probiotics behaved in your intestinal tract. I started reading all these books, listening to what they were telling me, and I started to reverse engineer the whole thing because this is how I'd been taught. You see, I'd been hanging around with these fellows from Grumman for 10 years, and they were all engineers. They were systems analysis engineers. They were physiologists. They all had a strong engineering background, so they imparted that to me, and I realized I had to reverse engineer this. So in doing that, I started to see what all these doctors were doing wrong. One of the first things I found in the medical textbooks was that Candida was an organism they referred to as dimorphic, meaning it could exist in two different states. It could exist as a fungus or as a yeast, and it was highly mutative. And one of the books in particular that talked about there's actually a textbook that talks nothing other than about Candida's ability to hang on to your gut lining, adhering to your gut lining.
Yeah.
And in this book, it talked about how Candida would mutate after it was exposed to any kind of substance, whether it was herbal or pharmaceutical or whatever. It would mutate after about 21 days. And that was pretty much along the line of what these people were telling me.
Yeah.
They got better, and then boom, it all came back. So I just continued on this course, and that's eventually how I ended up writing my book. The book is a compilation of everything I learned and all put together in a protocol, but I called it the Candida Chronicles, and we had a lot of titles picked out. And I had to call it the Candida Chronicles because the book actually chronicles my own personal journey into researching Candida and finding out all the mysteries. Because when you start speaking to patients and doctors about treating Candida, you eventually, if you dig deep enough, you hit into like an incredible amount of frustration they have because it's so difficult to treat and it just keeps coming back.
Yeah.
And I solved the riddle of why it comes back. And I put it together, I packaged it actually into a protocol that somebody could understand. They could read the book from beginning to end, and you really get why things happen, what you're doing wrong. Like, for instance, besides the mutation issue, common thing people do is they take probiotics initially to treat Candida. And that I found that just to be totally not workable because what we found is that when Candida is present in the gut, it repels the probiotics.
Oh, interesting.
So you can take all the probiotics you want. As a matter of fact, I was very fortunate. have as good colleagues at that time the folks from Great Smokies Laboratory. Now, you may know of Genova Laboratories
Yes.
nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Genova was originally Great Smokies, and there were two doctors in charge, Dr. Steve Barry and Dr. Marty Lee.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very, very good to me. They allowed my patients to submit stool samples free all the time. And we put a study together where we took about 30 people and we had them submit a stool sample every week for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And then we watched to see what would come up. And this is when they were developing the CDSA, which was going to be the first real Cadillac of stool tests.
Yeah.
And we saw the damnedest thing on the Candida parts of the test, the mycology part. The first week, let's say you get a bunch of people having no Candida showing. Next week, they all had the maximum amount showing. Then the next week, they'd have none. Then the next week, they'd have some. Then the next week, it was all over the map. And then that gave me the idea. I took the same 6 people and I sent them to 5 different parasitologists in Manhattan,
Mm-hmm.
including laboratories. And the reports I got back were all totally different.
Wow.
Every parasitologist, every lab told me something completely different on each of these
Yeah.
5 or 6 people. So this is when I really had to face facts that stool testing, as even though it sounds like a great concept,
Mm-hmm.
is flawed, and it's not flawed because of the technology or because of the human error. It's flawed because of the sampling type that you're dealing
Right.
with. There's a word homogenization or homogenize, which really explains this. Urine and blood are well homogenized. They're very evenly mixed,
Yeah.
thoroughly mixed, and the constituents of the blood and the urine are very fairly representative in any part of that sample. So whatever drop you take, it's going to be pretty even.
Yeah.
It's not true with stool because stool is a semi, like a semi mush,
Mm-hmm.
semi um, solid material that's mixed with a lot of fluids, and so you're not going to get any stool. So it's impossible for stool samples to really correctly or adequately show you parasites or yeast.
Yeah.
It's the problem with the sample, and it's even true of the new tests now. We have the DNA stool tests are the same way. It might
That
be a
makes
little
sense.
better, but they're essentially the same way. That there's an inconsistency in testing with them.
Yeah.
So we developed at that time a pattern to look for in a stool test that would tell you whether or not the person had Candida, even though Candida wasn't showing up in the stool, which
Mm.
occurred in many cases.
Yeah.
And we still use that same pattern today, although we're not allowed to disclose it or teach it because it goes against FDA standards to
Ah,
say something is there that you can't prove.
right.
It's in engineering we would call it an inference test. It's inferring
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to actually replicating. But that's where I ended up with my book. It was essentially from listening to patients and listening to where they had failed, what went wrong, and then reverse engineering each point. As an example, with the mutation with the medications, probiotics didn't work on people. All of these different items we found. Then we found people whose candida got much worse when they took
Mm-hmm.
different vitamins. And that was interesting because what that led me to start to read the liner notes of different antifungals. The
Yeah.
first one I read was nystatin, and I discovered that how one of the mechanisms of action for nystatin is that it blocks candida's ability to absorb iron.
Mm.
So I thought to myself, now that must be why when candida patients take iron, they get so much worse.
Yeah.
So then I moved to ketoconazole. And mode of action of ketoconazole is block the candida's ability to absorb vitamin D. And I thought about all these people who were taking vitamin D and their candida wasn't going away and it was flaring up. So I
Yeah.
could just continue to go through all these medications with the viewpoint, well, if the medicine kills candida by doing this,
Mm-hmm.
why would the patient want to do that?
Right.
You see?
Yeah. Makes total sense. Hmm. So many rabbit holes. So many rabbit holes. And so tell me with regards to what was one of the things that you kind of pulled out of that as well with regards to is there any kind of, like one thing that people would do from a nutritional perspective that would help them? Does that make
As
sense?
regards to
With
Candida?
Candida, yeah.
No, no, there really
No.
isn't.
Okay.
No, as a matter of fact, it's what you, but in a sense, the answer to your question is it's what they don't do that is most important. It's
Okay.
not what you do.
Mm-hmm.
As an example, there's no food a person's going to eat that's going to help them really get rid of Candida, with the exception maybe of garlic,
Yep.
or if you were going to use an oregano extract. But now you're going into medicinals, you
Right.
see. So but there's really no food somebody could eat that helps them get rid of Candida. There are only foods they will eat that make Candida worse,
Right.
which essentially are starches and sugar.
Yeah.
That's what Candida feeds on, so it gets worse.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on, I think the balance of the microbiome is super important. And so obviously you identified throughout your research that when we're talking about probiotics, that wasn't something that worked in these particular cases. So what else would be able to be utilized, even if maybe a following protocol from, ridding the body of Candida with some of the medications you talked about? What would that look like for balancing the microbiome and supporting it to be able to have those protocols continued so that they don't come back, we don't get those mutations?
Well, we have 4 steps essentially.
Yeah.
Actually 5, if we count 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Mm-hmm.
The first step originally was a colon cleanse to eliminate parasites,
Okay.
because we found that parasites could cause Candida.
Makes sense.
When someone got parasites, the parasites release ammonia, lots of ammonia into your colon, and the ammonia kills acidophilus,
Mm-hmm.
and then that would cause Candida. But then we became a little bit more sophisticated, and we upgraded the bowel cleanse into actually being able to mechanically scrape Candida off the gut lining. So not only kill parasites, but actually scrape the outer layers of Candida off. Then we put the next step there, which was the rotation of botanical antifungals that would kill Candida systemically. Then we put the next step after that was phase 2, which is where we use antifungals that are fatty acid based.
Mm-hmm.
And these are things like caprylic acid and undecylenic acid and lauricidin. These are fatty acids that kill Candida deep in your gut lining, because it's that region, the deep gut lining, that Candida there, that's what stops the probiotics from coming back. So that area of the intestinal tract has to be really disinfected of the Candida so that the probiotics can come back.
Yeah.
Then the next step we discovered was the use of prebiotics, not even probiotics,
Yeah.
because Candida so imbalances your gut that you've got to return some kind of normal, like a normal environment that will encourage the growth of the probiotics. And that has to do with pH. It has to do with the immune response, your digestive enzymes. There's a whole list of things that can serve as prebiotics, which encourage the probiotics from growing back.
Yeah.
So at that point in that research, we saw that really all we needed to do is, once we established the prebiotic, was to give a probiotic for the small intestine, which would be acidophilus, because that's what is there,
Mm-hmm.
and then bifidus bacteria for the colon.
Yeah.
And during that time, there were the probiotic wars, I call them, going on in the health food stores, where all the companies were arguing whose probiotic was better and how many strains of this, that, and the other one this one had and this one didn't have. And it's really funny, because going back into the textbooks, what I found was that when you establish a basic fundamental strain of lactobacillus,
Mm-hmm.
and it's there long enough, there are good mutations that occur, and all of these other strains of acidophilus that you hear about then just not naturally occurring in your gut as a natural mutation of that first original one. And the same thing is true of bifidus bacteria. So now when I see these commercials where these different probiotic companies are arguing that their product contains this strain and that strain, and this guy has this strain, it doesn't make a difference. It's great advertising, but ultimately, if you just establish your basic strain, all of those good mutations are going to occur, and you're going to have all those good strains anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What's your feeling on, because I know, there's a couple of other ones. One of them is the emergence of spore-based probiotics.
Those are a whole different league, you see.
Yeah.
Soil-based organisms are not normally part of your gut flora. They exist in only tiny amounts,
Mm-hmm.
and they're more used as therapeutic
Yep.
than they are part of your normal flora. And in a very healthy person, you might find less than 1% of their entire biome are soil-based organisms.
Okay.
But these are organisms that exist in the soil. That's where they were found,
Mm-hmm.
and they use a process that's called phagocytosis, which is essentially devouring the other bad organisms. So when you expose soil-based organisms to bad organisms, they literally eat them. That's
Okay.
how they kill them. They
Yep.
literally devour them.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be very effective in treatment, especially in young infants. That's my primary treatment for infants who have any of these types of dysbiosis is we give them the soil-based organisms because they're completely safe and gentle, and
Mm-hmm.
they eventually will get the job done. They're not the fastest in the race, but they eventually will get the job done.
Interesting. And I'll ask one more about just probiotics, and then we'll move on because there's so many more topics. But what about Saccharomyces boulardii?
That would qualify as a prebiotic.
Oh, okay. So you're qualifying that as a prebiotic. That's interesting. Okay.
Because what it does is it stimulates the IgE and IgA in your immune system in your
Mm-hmm.
intestines, and it also crowds around bad organisms to help neutralize them.
Yeah.
So that's changing the environment, making it more favorable for the probiotic to grow. So
Yeah. Makes total
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Okay. So, and obviously in your book, so I know this was written a number of years ago, but still completely relevant information. So if you're dealing with Candida, I think reading or purchasing and reading the Candida Chronicles is a good step in the right direction.
The person
Because,
wants to make sure they get the 1919 edition, which was updated.
okay, so
Originally came out
1919
in
edition.
2016. The 1919 is the updated edition. There's going to be another edition next year that's going to be
Nice.
updated again.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. So that's definitely one part. And I mean, I think that in your experience, because obviously you've done this for a number of decades, with regards to the number of people suffering from Candida that maybe don't even know, what are some of the what percentage do you think that might be? And again, you might not have that answer. I'm just curious.
It's probably 30% at any given time.
That's pretty
30% of
significant.
the total population, because Candida is iatrogenic. It's doctor induced. It's caused mostly by medications. You know,
Right.
we have triggers and we have underlying causes of Candida,
Hmm.
and the underlying causes of Candida, for the most part, are environmental toxicity that the person picks up, but the
Right.
trigger usually is an antibiotic or some
Mm.
medication that makes the Candida grow um, in abundance rather than being a subordinate part of your flora.
Yeah.
So if you got a person who, let's say, happens to have a lot of dental fillings,
Yeah.
and those dental fillings have leaked a lot of mercury into their body, or let's say the child was vaccinated and has a lot of mercury.
Hmm.
Well, if that kid gets an antibiotic, his flora gets wiped out really easily, and the Candida just grows like wildfire.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
you have a trigger and an underlying cause.
Yeah. Interesting. And yeah, and you think about the number of well, 30%, that's a significant number.
It's a wonder it's not more when you consider
I
um,
was
all the
well,
drugs that can cause Candida.
that the drugs, but also the other thing that's been coming up a lot, especially in the past, I say for us at least, kind of I would say 3 years anyways, is mold. And then the
Hmm.
relationship that mold has to have Candida and then oxalates and the whole wheel of all that, right? That's a huge problem for many people as well.
The
So,
funny thing with that is if you walk into a household that has mold,
mhm,
you want to find the sickest people. Find the ones there that are the most affected by the mold.
yep.
Those are the ones that will have Candida. The people who are least affected by the mold are the ones who don't have Candida. That's the difference. That's why you'll get
Yeah.
out of those maybe six people that live in the house, two of them are really in bad shape.
Hmm.
Those
Hmm.
people have Candida.
Oh, that's interesting. So they had Candida already, and then the mold exposure just like it's almost like
Yeah,
a medication. It just manifested into,
exactly.
oh, that
Yep.
makes sense. Okay. That makes total sense. And so what are some of the when you think about a lot of people get and this is very basic, but just with regards to food bases of prebiotics, what are some of your favorites?
Um, Kimchi is a very good one.
Yeah.
Sauerkraut, made
Mhm.
in a very traditional manner, is a very good one.
Okay.
But usually they're good because of the fiber content they have. Ultimately, kefir is probably the most powerful in terms of the account of probiotics you're going to get.
Yeah.
And if it's made correctly, you'll get a lower lactose reading on it. And that's one of the great things about Greek yogurt. Is the Greek yogurt is one of probably the lowest in sugar out of any yogurt.
Yeah.
And lactose does feed candida.
Mm.
So when we constantly get people saying, well, I can eat yogurt on the candida diet because it has acidophilus. And no, you can't, because the amount of lactose that it has is going to feed the candida faster than that acidophilus is going to be able to suppress it.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you feel about, like, with regards to kefir? I know that there's new, kind of things coming to the market. It's been out for a while, but even like coconut kefir and things like that. Do you feel that that has the same potential benefits as a traditional dairy?
I think the coconut kefir is actually better because
Oh,
the coconut kefir is going to have naturally occurring caprylic acid.
oh,
The
that's interesting.
MCT, the MCT oils
Hmm.
in coconut are what are eventually used to make caprylic acid, which is one of the key natural antifungals that
Hmm.
people will use and that we use on phase 2 to kill that deep-rooted intestinal candida.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately that's probably the better product.
Better choice. Wow. I'm glad I asked that question. That's interesting. I love giving little tidbits to people that can have an aha moment and go, oh, I need to put that in my diet. All right. And so let's talk about the connection of, like, because we're focusing on the gut, but what about that imbalance, how that affects the rest of the body? I mean, there's a huge tie-in with regards to even brain health and brain function when the microbiome isn't optimal.
This is true. And the problem is whenever you develop a dysbiosis, which basically means that you have an imbalance in that biome,
Hmm.
so often you get candida overgrowing. And once candida overgrows, it affects you in so many different ways. It's crazy. But one of the things that it will do is cause general inflammation. And when the cells in the intestinal tract become inflamed, it's much harder for your body to regulate your neurotransmitters and your hormones. Most doctors don't know what I'm about to tell you, is that your neurotransmitters and your hormones are largely stored in your intestinal tract, and the body shuffles them kind of back and forth to adjust things.
Mm-hmm.
But once you develop a dysbiosis, it's harder for the body to do that. And
Yep.
that's where you'll get prolonged hormone or neurotransmitter imbalances that seem to respond to doing some kind of microbiome balancing, which you would never think it would.
Yeah.
First glance, it sounds like it doesn't have anything to do with one. One doesn't have has nothing to do with the other, but they actually do for this reason that it's used as a balancing tool.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Which is also interesting is how hormones, if used incorrectly, wipe out your biome or aggravate your biome. Like any estrogen medication aggravates
Hmm.
candida. Estrogen
Yes.
makes candida grow. If you take a steroid or a glucocorticoid, any of the hormones from the cortisone family,
Hmm.
it aggravates candida. It makes candida grow again.
Hmm.
And a lot of SSRI drugs actually wipe out your biome, which is something else people don't know.
Yeah.
So you've got all of these, you have so many things stacked against you. As you were saying earlier, it's a miracle there isn't more than 30% of the people.
Well, even thinking about the number of women that are on the birth control pill or
Mm.
hormone replacement therapy during menopause, like, wow, because that does have a huge effect with regards to just candida in general, right?
Yes, especially
Um,
if they're not being tested and they
mhm.
don't have the right dose. That's the biggest problem I find is that
Yeah.
doctors will test a person once, put them on something, and never retest to make sure they have the right dosage. They'll just assume it's right. And
Hmm.
then the person goes on for months not feeling quite
Right.
right. And before you know it, and you test them and you now find out they have candida or something else.
Hmm. Yeah. And so you talked about testing, and, nutritional testing, candida testing, things like that. What is kind of your go-to test if somebody's going to test for candida from either a MD or an alternative therapist of some kind?
Well, so I would say it'd have to depend on the practitioner
Okay.
because they have different levels of understanding.
Mm,
When you're dealing with the average medical doctor, normally you want to have the medical doctor do a Candida blood antibody test
okay.
because that's something he will believe in. And
Mm-hmm.
if the antibodies are high, he has no choice but to then admit
But
the
to treat,
person
yeah.
has Candida overgrowth.
Yeah.
No, I would never want him to treat the patient, not if he
Mm-hmm.
was my patient. But at least you can gain an understanding with the doctor that there is an overgrowth of Candida because these antibodies are present.
Yeah.
If it's a more sophisticated doctor, we would go with probably the organic acids dysbiosis panel,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll take a look at the arabitol, because the arabinol is the most important of those organic acids.
Yeah.
And if that's elevated, that's usually a good sign they have Candida.
Yeah.
If the person is a thinker, we would have them use one of the modern stool tests, like the GI map test,
Mm-hmm.
but with the caveat that they understand the key to interpret the test. And there are several keys in interpreting the test, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually writing up right now in a manual for people. One of the keys is that if you don't find Candida showing,
Yeah.
you then immediately look at normal flora. And if there's an absence of E. coli, bifidus, or lactobacillus, that's highly suspect the person still has Candida. Then you look
Interesting.
at the stool pH.
Mm-hmm.
If the stool pH is above 7.2, that's another score that could indicate possible Candida. We'll call it a hidden Candida, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Then we look at the short chain fatty acids. If the butyrate is not in the correct range, if their short chain fatty acids are too low, then that's another score. And eventually you can rack all of these up, and eventually you'll find you can have 5 or 6 parameters which are telling you the person has Candida, but it's just not showing on the stool test for the reasons we talked about in the very beginning about stool being just
Yeah.
a bad testing medium.
Yeah, because I do find GI map sometimes like I've only seen it on a handful of tests where the Candida actually registers. So the other markers, it's very important and interesting too. Yeah. Yeah.
You have to know, you have to look at friendly bacteria or normal flora, commensal flora. You have to look at pH.
Mm-hmm.
You have to look at short chain fatty acids. You want to look at the fecal IgE and IgA, because if they're if there can be elevated, if the person is reasonably new in fighting Candida. If they're depressed, it could mean the person's had Candida for a very long time, and now that immune function has crashed.
Right. Right. Let's talk about that because that's an interesting connection because Candida, a balanced microbiome free of Candida or under control affects many different mechanisms in the body, but we mentioned depression. So, what are some of the other conditions, including anything related to mental illness, that can be tied up with that?
Well, the general effect of Candida is to cause inflammation
Mm-hmm.
throughout the body, and it releases mycotoxins. It releases alcohols, acetaldehydes. So, I mean, to the degree where there's a Japanese strain of Candida, which actually can release so much alcohol that people can be legally drunk who have it.
Wow.
So, if you look at that and you look at what that can do, you can then see Candida can cause rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
Candida can also cause osteoarthritis by depleting your magnesium, which then allows your calcium to drop out of solution and form deposits.
Mm-hmm.
So you can start looking at the different pathways, and you can see Candida can lead to all of these other illnesses where it's actually the underlying cause. I have a couple of physician friends who actually don't believe that Hashimoto's really exists. They think that
Oh,
Hashimoto's is Candida. They think that
wow.
everyone with Hashimoto's has Candida, because they point out how when you get Hashimoto's, you have leaky gut usually.
Mm-hmm.
They did a study where they looked at all these people with Hashimoto's, and the majority of them had leaky gut. And where did the leaky gut come from? The leaky gut came from Candida.
Right.
So that's their rationale, and
Yeah.
they'll swear that you cannot get rid of Hashimoto's without first handling leaky gut in the biome. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of truth to that.
Yeah. That makes total sense when you think about how they've approached that and the connection.
There's a product, Weston Childs, a brilliant doctor, who has a line of thyroid products.
Mm-hmm.
He has a Hashimoto's product, and one of the active ingredients in his Hashimoto's product is the black seed oil. Now,
Right.
when we start looking at black seed oil, what is it? Well, it's antimicrobial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's so
So,
interesting.
yeah.
So
So you
interesting.
see, so there's so many illnesses that the disrupted biome can cause. And when you really start to get into it and you start to look at the relationship between Candida and toxic metals,
Mm-hmm.
that leads you into a very interesting perspective because um, copper toxicity and Candida are highly associated.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the old days of Dr. Pfeiffer
Yep.
at the Brain Biocenter in Princeton, New Jersey, Pfeiffer showed beyond the shadow of a doubt that copper toxicity was involved in various forms of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his treatments for that was to give the person large amounts of niacin to bleed the copper out of their system.
Mm-hmm.
But see, we could argue that the copper was there in the first place because Pfeiffer never really so much got into the argument about the copper, why it was there.
Yep.
Although he did point out that a lot of the people living in old brownstones or buildings that had old copper plumbing, they'd leach a lot of that copper.
Mm-hmm.
But we now know that the Candida causes your body to retain a lot of copper.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we could say that, we know that Candida is involved in autism. It's very hard to find an autistic child who doesn't have Candida.
Yep.
And those neurological toxins affect him just like they would affect anyone else. But when you're looking at an autism case, I would say the main difference between a child who has autism today as opposed to that same child 200 or 300 years ago is his genetic weaknesses in terms of detoxification weren't being challenged 300 years ago,
Right. Yeah.
which is an interesting viewpoint. So you have a child 300 years ago who has really bad genes as far as detoxing, right? So if he
Mm-hmm.
went to any of the modern doctors that do the genetic testing on these kids, they
Yeah.
would be in bad shape.
Yeah.
But what 200, 300 years ago, what was he exposed to
Not
compared to
what.
today, right?
Yeah. We're not even the same ball game.
No.
Yeah.
Now you've got all the environmental pollution. You've got all the plastics.
Yep.
You've got the pollution in the air. You've got the vaccines the kid had that were loaded with thimerosal, which is a mercury preservative. So the kid's now overloaded with mercury and copper because that's part of it.
Yep.
And then also the amalgam fillings that the kids got were all high in copper and mercury.
Yeah.
So the kids nowadays are totally challenged as far as their inability to detoxify, where 200 or 300 years ago, nobody would have known the difference because he wasn't exposed to anything.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Let's bring a new player into the mix,
Yes.
which is COVID-19.
Mm.
Interesting study came out of, well, when COVID-19 first broke out,
Yeah.
we had a lot of people coming back to us who had completed their Candida programs who said, I got COVID, and now ever since I have COVID, I swear the Candida's back.
Oh.
So we went ahead and tested them when we found that they were right. Candida came back.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an article that came out about a year and a half ago that explained it. There was an abstract out of Japan. The Japanese found that the COVID vaccine killed bifidus bacteria in your colon. So we now know that if someone is vaccinated for COVID, besides all the other controversies and the problems you hear,
Yeah.
they could easily get Candida because that vaccine acts just like an antibiotic, killing your bifidus bacteria.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So many things to dig into, layers, and oh my gosh, I could talk to you for a week.
There's a lot of data.
We're gonna have to come back for part 2 because we only got to one of the actual topics that we were gonna address. There's so much more here to unravel. So hopefully you'll be happy to join me again.
Oh, I'd
to
love
be able
to.
to dig into some
love
more
to.
because I have so many questions. So many questions, so many rabbit holes to go down.
Sure.
Yeah. So first off, I want to thank you for being here with us today. It's been amazing. And I know that, so first off, 1919 edition, Candida Chronicles, I suggest you download that or pick it up. We'll have all the links in the description to be able to lead you to that, and with the right edition, of course. And we'll also share any socials where you can follow Dr. Biamonte and all this amazing information. So first off, thank you for being here with us again. I appreciate your time. We are going to invite you back because I think this was amazing information, and I know we have a lot more to share. For those of you watching on YouTube, we're here every 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and give this episode a like. If you are listening on your favorite podcast host, make sure you give this episode a thumbs up, and we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us today on the Human Optimization Podcast. Episode technical production is by Grace Sylvester and guest booking by Stu Tate. Want to learn more? Visit LisaPitel-Killah.com for incredible free resources to supercharge your journey to becoming the best version of you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe to the Human Optimization Podcast and follow me on social media at Lisa Pitel-Killah.